There is a very common, very quiet assumption hidden inside the sentence, "Nothing brings me joy anymore." It sounds like a report, like a diagnosis, like a simple observation. As if joy were a substance that used to arrive on schedule and has now failed to show up. As if life were a shop window, and one morning you woke up to find it empty, the lights still on, but nothing inside worth stopping for. Most people don't even notice the assumption. They simply carry it with them, like a weight they've learned to balance. The assumption is this: that joy is something life gives, and that when it stops arriving, something must have gone wrong, either with life or with you. And yet, if you watch something that is not human, this assumption begins to look rather strange. Watch a cat sitting by a window, not doing anything productive, not achieving a state, not improving itself. The cat isn't waiting for joy to arrive. It isn't checking whether the moment is meaningful enough. It simply sits, because sitting is what is happening. The light moves across the floor. The tail flicks once. There is no internal commentary saying, "This used to feel better," or "I should be enjoying this more." Now, this isn't because the cat has discovered a superior philosophy. It's because the cat has not learned a particular trick that humans are taught very early on. The trick of standing slightly outside experience and evaluating it while it happens. That trick seems harmless at first. In fact, it's praised. We call it reflection, awareness, intelligence. We're told it's what makes us human. But over time, it becomes like holding a mirror in front of a mirror. Instead of seeing what is happening, we see ourselves seeing it. And then we see ourselves failing to feel what we think we should feel. Joy, under those conditions, becomes a performance. When people say nothing brings them joy anymore, what they often mean, though they don't phrase it this way, is that nothing is passing the test. Nothing is generating the internal signal they've learned to label as, "This is working." Life still unfolds, events still occur, sensations still arise, but none of them register as sufficient. And here's where a metaphor quietly suggests itself, not as an explanation, but as a way of noticing. Imagine listening to music through a pair of headphones with a very aggressive noise-canceling feature. At first, it feels impressive. All the background noise disappears. The world becomes clean, controlled, curated. But after a while, something odd happens. The music itself starts to feel thin, flat. You turn up the volume, but it doesn't help. You switch songs, still nothing. Eventually, you conclude the music is bad now, that it no longer moves you the way it used to. But the problem isn't the music, it's the filter. In much the same way, modern consciousness runs with an extremely strong filter. It filters moments through expectation, through comparison with memory, through anticipation of future payoff, through the question, often unspoken but constantly present, is this enough? And anything that must pass through that many checkpoints is unlikely to feel alive. What's particularly cruel about this process is that it doesn't announce itself. It feels like maturity, like realism, like having grown past naive pleasures. People will even say, with a strange mixture of pride and sadness, "I guess I've just outgrown things," as if joy were a childish hobby, like collecting stickers or believing in magic. But notice how this story quietly centers a very tense identity. There is a self who remembers how things used to feel. There is a self who monitors how things feel now. And there is a self who judges the difference. 3 layers of me, standing around a single moment, staring at it, waiting for it to perform. Under that kind of gaze, almost anything will wither. The present moment, after all, is not designed to satisfy an audience. It doesn't arrive with a soundtrack or a guarantee. It's usually subtle, uneven, unfinished. It doesn't care whether it justifies itself. And when you approach it with the posture of someone checking for results, it tends to go quiet, not out of spite, but because you're no longer listening in the way you once did. This is why the loss of joy so often coincides with a heightened sense of control. The more tightly life is organized around meaning, purpose, trajectory, and improvement, the more suspicious simple moments become. You sit with a cup of coffee, and instead of tasting it, you wonder why it doesn't feel like it used to. You walk outside, and instead of noticing the air, you check your internal dashboard. Mood low, motivation absent, joy unconfirmed. And slowly, without any dramatic event, experience turns into data. The strange irony is that this process often begins as an attempt to feel more, to understand yourself better, to be conscious, to be awake. But when awareness becomes self-surveillance, it creates a constant low-grade tension, a sense that something should be happening that isn't, that life is slightly late, that you are behind. And from within that tension, joy doesn't disappear, it simply has nowhere to land. Pause here for a moment and notice how different this is from the usual explanation. There's no claim that something is broken, no diagnosis of emptiness as a permanent condition, just the observation that attention, when bent too tightly around evaluation, loses its ability to receive. Not because joy is rare, but because it was never meant to be summoned. There's another assumption quietly hiding beneath the first one, and it tends to surface only after the loss of joy has lingered for a while. It's the idea that something should be felt, and that if it isn't, the absence itself must be explained. Not just noticed, but justified, interpreted, solved. So the mind begins to search backward and forward at the same time. Backward, to locate the moment things changed. Forward, to imagine a future version of yourself who somehow feels normal again. And right there, stretched between memory and expectation, the present becomes a narrow, uncomfortable bridge you're always trying to cross instead of inhabit. Notice how heavy that is. It turns experience into a waiting room. You're not actually living the moment, you're checking whether the moment is a sign, whether it means something about your trajectory, whether it confirms a story about decline, burnout, awakening, depression, growth. The labels vary, but the structure is the same. The moment is no longer allowed to be what it is. It has to report back. This is why joy, under these conditions, begins to feel almost suspicious. If a good feeling does arise, a laugh, a warm sensation, a brief lightness, it's often immediately grabbed, inspected, and compared. See, it's still there, but why doesn't it last? And the very act of asking that question drains it of whatever life it had. It's like trying to hold water tightly in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it escapes. And then you conclude that water is unreliable. What's rarely questioned is the grip. Now, if you listen closely, there's a certain seriousness that creeps into this whole situation. A seriousness about life, about the self, about emotional states. As if joy were a responsibility you've failed to maintain, as if feeling alive were another metric on an already long list of things to manage properly. And seriousness has a peculiar effect on perception. Think of a child absorbed in play, not playing to feel joy, but playing because play is what's happening. There's no self-monitoring. No inner narrator saying, "This is fun." The moment doesn't need a label. It's complete without commentary. Adults often assume they've lost this because life has become harder, more complex, more demanding. But complexity alone doesn't kill joy. What does is the constant attempt to stand apart from experience and handle it. This is where identity begins to harden. You don't just experience low joy, you become someone for whom joy is absent. It turns into a trait, a chapter, a personal weather pattern. And once it becomes part of who you think you are, everything you experience gets filtered through that identity. Pleasant moments feel temporary and untrustworthy. Neutral moments feel empty. Difficult moments feel confirming. And so the story feeds itself. This isn't a failure of optimism or gratitude. It's a structural issue, a way of relating to experience that quietly replaces participation with observation. Life becomes something you watch yourself living, instead of something you're inside. The cat at the window, again, doesn't have this problem, not because it's wiser, but because it isn't divided against itself. There isn't a watcher watching the watcher. There's just movement, sensation, rest, no inner audit. Humans, on the other hand, are incredibly good at creating a double exposure. We live the moment and simultaneously evaluate it. And over time, the evaluation becomes louder than the living. So when you say nothing brings you joy anymore, it may not be that joy has vanished. It may be that joy, which is quiet and easily overlooked, is being drowned out by a constant internal conversation about how things are supposed to feel. And conversations, especially repetitive ones, have a way of filling all available space. The deeper tension here isn't emotional numbness. It's the exhaustion of constantly referencing yourself, of turning every moment into a mirror, of asking life to reflect something back to you, instead of letting it pass through. What's interesting is that this state often feels like clarity, like seeing things as they really are, as if the veil has been lifted and the truth is simply bleak. But bleakness too is a mood, a tone, a lens. It's not reality stripped bare, it's reality filtered through a particular posture of attention. And attention, when rigid, tends to flatten whatever it touches. This is why attempts to fix the lack of joy often fail. They operate at the same level as the problem. They add more effort, more monitoring, more expectation. They tighten the grip. They increase the noise canceling. And the music, once again, fades. Not because it's gone, but because the room is too quiet in the wrong way. There is a subtle fear that often sits underneath all of this, and it rarely announces itself directly. It doesn't say, "I'm afraid." It says something more respectable, more reasonable. It says, "I just want to understand what's happening to me." Or, "I don't want to waste my life feeling nothing." Or, "Something feels off, and I need to get to the bottom of it." On the surface, these sound like healthy impulses, sensible ones. But look a little closer, and you'll notice the tension they carry. They imply that the current experience is not only unpleasant, but unacceptable, that it must be resolved before life can continue properly. And that turns the present moment into a problem. Once the moment is a problem, you no longer meet it openly. You interrogate it. You lean toward it with a question already formed. You ask, "Why am I like this?" instead of noticing what is actually here. And the moment, faced with interrogation, tends to contract. It gives shorter answers, blunter ones, sometimes none at all. Silence, under those conditions, feels threatening. This is why emptiness and numbness are so often misread. They're interpreted as absences, as failures of feeling. But many times, what's being experienced isn't emptiness at all. It's the pause that happens when constant stimulation, constant meaning-making, constant emotional narration temporarily drop out. Imagine standing in a room where a fan has been running all day. You don't really hear it anymore. It fades into the background. Then someone turns it off. Suddenly, the silence feels loud, uncomfortable, almost alarming. Not because something bad has happened, but because you've grown accustomed to the noise. In much the same way, when the usual emotional signals go quiet, the excitement, the anticipation, the rush of significance, the mind interprets that quiet as loss, as danger, as something that must be corrected. And so it rushes to fill the space. It fills it with analysis, with labels, with stories about burnout, disconnection, lost purpose. Not because these stories are necessarily false, but because story itself feels safer than silence. A narrative, even a bleak one, gives the mind something to hold on to, something to be. This is where control enters the picture more forcefully. If joy is no longer arriving on cue, perhaps it can be engineered. If meaning doesn't arise naturally, perhaps it can be constructed. Goals are set, habits are optimized, moods are tracked. Everything becomes intentional, deliberate, managed. And yet, the more controlled experience becomes, the less spontaneous it feels. Life starts to resemble a carefully maintained exhibit rather than a living process. You're involved, but slightly removed. Engaged, but tense. Always aware of how things are going. The irony is that joy, when it appears, is almost never intentional. It sneaks in sideways. It arrives while you're distracted, while you're not checking, while you're momentarily unguarded. And the moment you notice it and think, "Ah, there it is," it's already slipping away. Not because it's fragile, but because it doesn't like being watched. This creates a peculiar frustration. You remember that joy exists, but you can't reproduce it at will. You know what it feels like, but you can't summon it. And this gap between memory and present experience becomes painful. Not dramatically so, but persistently, like a low ache you carry everywhere. And so life starts to feel thinner, less textured, as if you're walking through familiar rooms where the furniture has been removed. Nothing is wrong, exactly, but nothing quite lands. What's rarely acknowledged is how much identity is invested in this struggle. There is an image of yourself as someone who used to feel deeply, someone who was moved, excited, engaged. And there is an image of yourself now, standing at a distance, observing. The gap between these two images creates a sense of loss, not just of joy, but of self. You're not only asking, "Why don't I feel joy?" You're asking, "Who am I if I don't?" And that question carries a great deal of weight. It suggests that joy is proof of aliveness, of authenticity, of meaning. Without it, something essential must be missing. And so the absence of joy becomes existentially threatening, not merely unpleasant. But this, too, is part of the same pattern, the tying of identity to internal states. The assumption that who you are depends on how you feel. That experience must continuously validate the self. When experience stops cooperating, the self feels endangered. And in response, it tightens its grip even further. At this point, the loss of joy isn't just about pleasure or motivation. It's about control, certainty, and the fear of groundlessness. The fear that without a familiar emotional compass, you won't know how to orient yourself in the world. And so you keep checking, keep scanning, keep asking whether something has returned. All the while, something quieter is happening underneath. Life continues, sensations arise, time passes, people speak, light changes, the body breathes. None of this requires joy to justify itself. None of it waits for your approval. But when you're busy watching yourself for signs of feeling alive, these things rarely get your full attention. They don't announce themselves loudly enough. There is a strange relief that sometimes appears when all the searching grows tired. Not relief in the sense of happiness returning, or answers finally arriving, but a quieter kind. The relief of no longer pushing against what is already here. It often comes unannounced, not as a breakthrough, not as a realization you could explain clearly to someone else, but as a subtle softening. A moment when the question, "Why don't I feel joy?" simply loses urgency. Not because it's been answered, but because it stops feeling like an emergency. And that softening changes the texture of experience in ways that are easy to miss. When you stop demanding that the moment prove itself, the moment doesn't suddenly become magical. It becomes ordinary again. And ordinary, strangely enough, is where most of life has always lived. Not in peaks, not in dramatic emotional confirmations, but in the simple, continuous unfolding of things as they are. The difficulty is that ordinariness doesn't sparkle. It doesn't reassure the self. It doesn't tell a story about progress or decline. It just happens. And for a mind that has learned to measure life by intensity, meaning, or emotional payoff, this can feel disappointing at first. Flat. Almost disappointing enough to call empty. But emptiness, here, is not a void. It's the absence of commentary. Think again of that room after the fan is turned off. At first, the silence feels wrong, too exposed, too still. But if you stay there long enough without trying to fill it, you begin to notice subtler sounds. The distant hum of traffic, the creak of the building, your own breathing, sounds that were always present but drowned out. In much the same way, when the constant internal narration quiets, even slightly, experience reveals layers that were never dramatic enough to register as joy, but were never dead either. Warmth in the hands, a shift in light across a wall, the simple fact of being tired and sitting down. These things don't announce themselves as meaningful. They don't solve anything, but they are undeniably real. And reality, when not forced to perform, has a certain steadiness to it. What often dissolves at this stage is the idea that joy is something separate from life, something added on top, like a reward or confirmation. When that idea loosens, joy stops being a goal and starts being more like a side effect. Not guaranteed, not permanent, but also not missing in the way it once seemed. It appears and disappears the way weather does. And just as importantly, its absence stops feeling like a personal failure. There is no longer the same urgency to label the moment, to decide whether it's good or bad, meaningful or pointless. The moment is allowed to be incomplete, unfinished, slightly dull, slightly unclear, which is how most moments actually are. This doesn't create a constant state of pleasure. It creates something far less dramatic, but far more sustainable. A willingness to be where you are without demanding that it feel different. And in that willingness, tension eases. Not all at once, not permanently, but enough for experience to breathe. The mind, no longer occupied with checking whether joy has returned, becomes less dense, less tight. It stops folding in on itself. And when that happens, attention naturally turns outward again. Not in search of stimulation, but simply because there is space. You notice people without comparing yourself to them. Time passes without being measured quite so closely. Work happens without every moment being weighed against an internal ideal. Loss is still loss. Fatigue is still fatigue. Nothing is erased. But nothing is required to justify your existence either. And perhaps this is the quiet shift that sits underneath the whole question. Not a return of joy as it once was, but a loosening of the belief that life must constantly feel a certain way in order to be valid. When that belief softens, joy may appear again, or it may not, at least not in familiar forms. But either way, experience regains its depth, its texture, its capacity to be felt without being evaluated. And that, in itself, is not a solution. It's simply a different way of standing inside the moment, a way that doesn't ask so much of it, a way that lets it arrive exactly as it is, without needing to prove that it brings you joy.